Hey guys, welcome back. Hope you all are doing well. This is Mohammad Badruddin back again with another video from the API testing module from Portstrigger Web Security Academy. Before going further, if you like the content, please like, subscribe and share as much as you can. Fine, so let's dive into it. In the previous videos, I define API, I define why the API security is important to us and how that API works. I also provided some examples so that you can understand better. There are a bunch of very good resources here on the Portstrigger website. You can see here OWASP API Security Top 10 2023. So in this list, you will find top 10 security issues in the APIs. Fine, so these resources are very good and I highly recommend to visit and see top 10 security issues are there. Okay. Now in today's lab, we are going to see API reconnaissance. So the first phase of ethical hacking, testing, penetration testing, okay, bug bounty hunting. So the first step is reconnaissance. Fine. So in the phase of reconnaissance, you try to gather as much information as you can about the target. Here we are going to actually perform the active reconnaissance so that we have more surface to find out the vulnerabilities. Fine. So methodologies, concept and thought process is very, very important in ethical hacking penetration testing, because without methodology, without correct thought process, you may miss a lot of things. Fine. So the first thing about application and especially API testing, whenever you are going to test any web application, maybe that web application is using API, which most of them uses today. Everything goes with the API. Fine. So first of all, we need to find out the endpoints of the API. Okay. So we go and check each and every request, we check each and every process, and we need to find out the endpoint of the API. Okay, this is important. So you should find out information about the following. What? The input data, the API processes, including both compulsory and optional parameter. Fine. So once you get the API endpoint, after that you need to find out parameters, optional data, compulsory data. Fine, about input data. Second thing, we need to find out the type of request the API accepts, like that API endpoint may accept get, put, patch, post, delete, update. Okay, so which type of request the API accepts. If it is HTTP, what methods are there that can be accepted by the API. The third thing, which is very important, is the rate limit and authentication mechanism. Okay, this is very, very important, because a lot of time what happened, API is there and anyone can access that API, whether it's authenticated user or unauthenticated user. What an end user feels like, suppose that I go to any website, it asks me to log in. Okay, I log into the website, but even if I do not log in, I can directly access the API endpoint. I can directly access the features of that API endpoint without authentication. But for normal user, if any website shows that, okay, you need to put the username and password and authenticate first. So normal user will see, okay, I authenticate first, then authorization process, something authorization mechanism is there, and then after that I can access any endpoint. For example, there is an API for books, okay, and I can get the list of all the books. Although even if I do not authenticate, I can access the list of books if authentication and authorization mechanism is not properly configured or placed with the application. Fine. So these are all the things we need to check. So this is the first thing in the reconnaissance phase. Also API documentation. Somehow this is also the part of API reconnaissance, because what happened, a lot of time the API documentation is placed with the application. The endpoints never redirect you or pointed you to directly go to access the documentation, because the options on the screens are there to search something, to put any product into the cart, and then once you go to the cart there is a button to check out. Okay, so normal user do not see that I can also access the documentation, but an ethical hacker or a penetration tester, they can look for the documentation. If they find the documentation for that API, it will be very easy for them to test more and more about that API, and they can find out the way to manipulate things, manipulate requests, and they can get what is not intended to do. Fine. So this is also very important. In a second I will come on API documentation, but before, you can see here documentation can be in both format, human readable and machine readable forms. So human readable documentations is designed for developers to understand how to use the API. Okay, and it will basically give you a clear picture how that API is integrated within the system if you have complete documentation. So it may include detailed explanations, examples, and usage scenarios. And machine readable documentation is designed to be processed by the software for automating tasks like API integration and validation. Fine. So it is written in structured formats like JSON and XML. I will show you in a minute. Fine. So API documentation is also important. If you find out the API endpoint, then you should look for documentation. And if you get the documentation, it is going to help you very much. Now, there are some popular APIs and its documentation, endpoint, and file name. So you can see /API. So you can find the documentation on the same endpoint. You can find the documentation /Swagger within that index.html. There is also a file openapi.json. In that all these endpoints you can find the documentation. So if you are enumerating the endpoints and API endpoint, you can enumerate these default API documentation, and if it is there, this is going to help you to further enumerate things and to understand how the processes are written. Now, if you identify an endpoint for a resource, make sure to investigate the base path. Okay, base path means this one. You just going to check the features, the process of the application or the flow of the application. Fine. And in that flow, you find one endpoint, which is this. Okay. So the base path is /API. So what you need to do, delete this one and check what's inside this path. Okay, up to here. Then you need to check what's inside up to here, then what's inside up to here, and then what exists within this API base path. Okay, so like this, you can see here it's mentioned. Fine. Now this is done. Now we can access our lab. But before going to that lab, I just want to give you a look and feel about the API documentation. And the best way to do this is Swagger. So this is an open API documentation. Fine. So let's go. If I open up this Swagger API documentation and design tools. Okay. So here we are. This Swagger, as I mentioned, this is an open API specification. So it primarily focuses on the API design, documentation, and specification. Fine. So it facilitates collaboration among stakeholders, ensures API integrity, and supports organization-wide adoption. The ideal usage of Swagger is whenever you need to design, document, and specify APIs in a structured and standardized manner. Now, back to the business. We need to see the API documentation. So there are tools. Okay, these are these are open source. So we go to the open source. So in open source, you will see three things: Swagger Code Gen, Swagger Editor, and Swagger UI. So as you can see here, API editor for designing API with the Open API and async API specification. And if we try to go to Swagger UI, you will see the difference, but this one is just give you the more interactive user interface. Okay, so let's see, this is the API editor. So I'm going to try Swagger editor. And if I go to the Swagger UI, let's go to live demo and we will see the difference. So this is the editor. Okay, and here you can see this is all of its code, schema, collections, tags, all the endpoints, features, everything is here, right? Okay. The UI, which is more interactive, it is not going to show you all this, but only graphical user interface. These both are the same thing. You can see here in this left hand side, you can see in the coded format, and here you can see its graphical user interface. So, and this one is only graphical user interface. So this is a documentation where you can see how the request worked, what parameters it needed, which kind of method it's using. All these things are there. So let's say here it's saying pet ID, find pet by ID. Okay, so I go here. You can see I need the input field will be pet ID. So once I say try out and I say, let's say pet ID 1, and I execute it, directly go to the browser and put this command. This is the same what we are doing here in the graphical user interface. Fine. You can send the same request by curl command. Okay, so you can see the code is 404. That means pet is not found. That means there is no pet having ID 1. If I say, let's say 10 and execute again. So now you can see the status code is 200 and there is one pet whose ID is 10 and the name is doggy and there is no status. Fine. So this is how you can see everything about that API in a single page. Fine. So maybe while you are accessing all the features about that application and API, maybe some features are hidden or currently not in work. So at the time of testing, you cannot see that features or that request into manually enumerating the application. But if you get the documentation, you will see everything here. Okay. Similarly, you can upload the image, add a new pet to the store. Find pet with the status. So let's go to this. And so there are 3 options. If the pet is available or not. So give me the list of all the pets. Those are available in the store, pending or sold. So let's say try out. I want to see a list of all the pets available in the store. So once I execute, so you can see by curl command also we can do this, and the status code is 200 and these are all the pets available. You can see the status is available. This is fish and this is puff available, hamster available. Fine. So you get the idea. I just want you to see and take a look and feel about how that API documentation looks like. Maybe the colors may be changed or something, but it is like this. Fine. So I'm going to close all of these and now back to the lab. I'm going to access it. And now let's see, it's saying exploiting an API endpoint using documentation. So to solve the lab, find the exposed API documentation and delete the Carlos user. You can log into your own account using the following credential, Wiener and Peter. Okay. Required knowledge to solve this lab, you will need to know what we need to know, what API documentation is, how API documentation may be useful to an attacker, which I already described to you, how to discover API documentation. So we will see all of these. These points are covered in API Testing Academy topic. We already see that. So I'm going to access the lab, and what I'm thinking, let's complete this lab in another video, because if I solve this lab in the same video, so maybe I will care about the time, so I skip few points which I really don't want to skip. So I want to show you the workaround and different ways to do the same thing. Okay, so that's it for this video. See you in the next video. Bye.